Well, there you have it. After more than a year and a half and 10 public hearings by the January 6th committee, today they are making criminal and ethics referrals, recommending accountability for not only the President of the United States, but ethics investigations into several members of Congress. Want to bring on our panel, John Dickerson. This is unprecedented. It is historic for a congressional committee to do this.
It is, and it's also, remember where we've traveled from. I mean, the story that allowed them to make those 4 referrals is one that is told by all of Donald Trump's closest associates. We saw some new footage today of Hope Hicks, perhaps as close to Donald Trump at times in his presidency than anyone else, saying that she asked him to tell those supporters that were coming to Washington when the president, 2 years ago to this day, said, come to Washington, it'll be wild. She said, tell them to be peaceful. He refused. So there's even more and new detail about this extraordinary moment at which the period was put on it today.
We've known this, Robert, but again, the premeditation that was involved. They've laid that out throughout these hearings. They repeated it again today. Then what they called the shameful actions of the President of the United States. While our United States Capitol was being violently attacked, the President sitting there in his dining room, watching it. We've known members of Congress urged him, as well as staff, to call in to try and stop it. He didn't do that. And then more today about what happened after the president knew these were lies, and he knew that he had lost the election.
And the question is, Nora, who's listening? Are Republicans across the country watching this? When you think about Richard Nixon in 1974, Republican senators went to him, like Senator Barry Goldwater, a conservative, and said, sir, it's time to go. You've lost support. Trump still has support inside this Republican Party. He's now again a federal candidate running again for the White House. No one has yet jumped into the race to run against Trump for the nomination in 2024. What I will be watching in the coming days, does Congresswoman Liz Cheney decide to run for that GOP nomination and contest Trump not only through this committee, but to his face, perhaps on a debate stage?
And the likelihood that Liz Cheney will announce that she's running for president is?
She's leaning into it.
Yes, and she still has plenty of money left in her campaign account in order to do that. And today, those remarks that she gave were not in prepared remarks that sounded like the beginning of a presidential speech.
Indeed.
Nicole, you cover the Hill so closely. What stood out to you today?
Well, I think most notably these referrals to the Ethics Committee of 4 members of Congress. And we know from the executive summary that the committee is releasing, which will be part of that broader report that we see this week. These are individuals like House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, like Congressman Andy Biggs, 2 of whom are mounting a bid to be Speaker in the next Congress, which is significant, along with Congressman Scott Perry and Congressman Andy Biggs, for their roles and for defying the subpoenas that were issued by this select committee. So again, will any further action be taken against these individuals? Will they be sanctioned as the committee has requested? That remains to be seen because, as you know, House Republicans take over at the beginning of the next Congress, and they have made clear that they have no appetite for this committee in any way.
I think you make a really important point, since Republicans will be taking control, whether that's really going to mean anything. And, Jeff, on that same point, even though this is significant, very significant, the body of work that this committee has done investigatively and laying out this complete narrative, and the Justice Department will use some of that information as well as their own investigative work. What the committee did today, it doesn't carry any legal weight, correct?
No, but there was one charge there that really stood out to me, this obstruction of an official proceeding. Our team has done a little crunching of the numbers, and what we found, of the 930 people charged in connection with January 6th, about 300 of them have been charged with obstruction of an official proceeding. So that is a very real charge that a jury has bought in a court of law. So while a lot of this process was symbolic, if you will, for history, in terms of the law, that is an official charge that could be used. In fact, all 5 of the Oath Keepers who were recently on trial were found guilty of that charge.
That's an excellent point, Jeff Pegues. Let's bring in Scott McFarland, who is at the wall for us. And, Scott, break that down.
Yeah, 930 federal defendants so far in the U.S. Capitol attack. Nearly a third have been charged with obstruction of an official proceeding. But something else jumped out to me, Nora. As they announced these 4 criminal referrals, all 4 against former President Trump. That was no surprise. But these are the other big players we heard about throughout the investigation and today. Mark Meadows, the chief of staff. Jeffrey Clark, the 11th hour choice by Trump to be a last-minute attorney general. That fizzled. Rudy Giuliani, and John Eastman, that architect of the January 6 memo to have the vice president intervene in the electoral count. Only criminal referrals for Trump and Eastman. Why is that? What's different? This goes back to a California federal civil case between Eastman and the January 6 committee. The committee wanted Eastman's emails, wanted them so bad, they had a federal court battle over it. When the judge in California issued his order, the judge said in so many words, it's likely Eastman and Trump engaged in a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, what we were just describing. They have the cover of this federal judge, the committee does, to make a criminal referral. Nora, they think that'll have unique weight with the Justice Department.
Let's talk about that specific insurrection charge, and we can put it up on the screen, and John, and talk about why that is so incredibly significant. As is noted, whoever incites, sets foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States or gives aid or comfort to there shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. And here's the key point, shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. Trump is, of course, already announced his run for the presidency.
He has. I mean, so what's interesting about that is what we've seen in the testimony, and again, Hope Hicks's testimony today, is show that he was inciting, he was creating the conditions for this moment in all kinds of different ways. It wasn't just what happened on that day, it was what was leading up to it. We've also had testimony in these hearings that he knew they were armed and not being led into his rally, and he said, no, bring them in. So this idea of pouring gasoline on the fire, that leads right to the insurrection. But in the political question, the question is whether Republicans who fall into three categories. Either there are those Republicans who think the insurrection was just a practice and it's just a shame it didn't go better. There are those who just think of it as a small, mild irritation, not even as bad as maybe supporting the wrong kind of person in a primary. And then the Republicans who actually are in a very small group who say, no, this was a bad thing. What do those people do now? What's their verdict on this episode in American life among this? When Judge Luttig said this is a clear and present danger, that's what he meant. Do you look at this and think it is a bad thing, or do you brush it aside because it just happens to be your political team? That's the other large political question that's out there.
Let's bring in Major Garrett, who is our chief Washington correspondent. On that point, didn't we just an election tell us what the voters thought about it in some ways?
The election did, Nora, give us a verdict on what is the orientation that people who seek public office should have to a close election or an election they're unhappy with. You accept defeat and you concede. More often than not, that's what happened. And those who, for a while or continuously waved the election denial banner, they lost in conspicuous statewide races across the country. That was one of many verdicts from the midterm election, and it is not in any way, shape, or form removed from what the body of evidence this committee has presented to the country for a full year. One other quick point, Nora. Jamie Raskin said, the evidence we have put together, meaning speaking for the committee, is inescapable, that we must refer these 4 charges against former President Trump. That language is very important to the Justice Department. It's not just a recommendation. Jamie Raskin said on behalf of the committee, this is inescapable evidence, and that for justice to work in this country, foot soldiers in an insurrection cannot be the only ones prosecuted. The masterminds and ringleaders must also be prosecuted to make justice real. That is a powerful statement from this committee to a very closely observant Justice Department.
It's an excellent point, Major Garrett. You know, one other interesting thing that we learned a bit more detail on today was the question about tampering with witnesses. That was one of these unanswered questions from some of the public hearings that we've had. And then Robert Zolofgren on the committee saying today they have continued evidence that a lawyer who was being paid by some of these funds may have enticed one of the witnesses with a job offering.
The investigators on this committee are in the same position as so many reporters. We're asking the question, what don't we still know about what happened before and after January 6th? The committee alluded to the fact that they believe some witnesses were corralled in a certain direction by forces unknown, perhaps people in former President Trump's orbit. And we learned here at CBS News over the weekend, we got the full Michael Flynn deposition, that he pled the Fifth, invoked it repeatedly throughout his deposition, his right against self-incrimination. And that shows us some of the key players like Michael Flynn, like some of these witnesses, they didn't provide any story to this committee. There's a lot more of this story still to be told and still to be reported.
Yeah, I want to bring in Nicole. And so, we've talked about here, this committee believes that this work is so incredibly important in not only uncovering the truth, the historical record, but also demanding accountability. What about the effort by members of Congress with this Electoral Count Act, Reform Act?
Well, that is one of the legislative proposals coming out of this, and hopefully, perhaps we will see action before this Congress is up on that very point. This is legislation that would essentially clarify the role of the vice president, clarify the role of Congress in terms of certifying the results of the election. Right now, there is the hope or anticipation that it will be attached to a funding bill, that we are still awaiting that text, but obviously this would be significant if Congress could get it through.